Because yeah, we like. Good afternoon. On behalf of Center for Justice, Law and Society, we'd like to welcome you to the Law, Sexuality and Society Lecture and Conversation Series 2022. We started this series in 2012, and we're really excited to do this in person post-pandemic. The first series, this semester series is titled Power and Resistance, Reimagining Gender, Sexual Politics and the Law. And we are honored to have Aruk Akun start us off in this really exciting series. Aruk is an interdisciplinary artist working on identity formation. They are the initiator behind community-based interventions such as the Dalit Art Archive and Dalit Sphere Project. Um, we're going to have Aruk speak to us for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll just leave it for open conversation, question, answers, and comments. Thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you for having me and organizing this series. Um, I just wanted to, talk about, since I've been now informed that the conversation, it will be a conversational lecture. I just wanted to begin with why the topic, caste and queer aspirations in politics, is because I come from that school of thought where caste does shape queerness and aspirations. And so why should politics be any different? And originally, when people in public spaces, Dalit people began asserting in public spaces that something like caste exists, there was such a pushback from all ends saying caste does not exist. What are you doing? You're dividing the community. But we knew better, because this is also the same thing which was told to Ambedkar when they were saying that untouchables need rights. And some of us still are born in those legacies of untouchability. And we are still sort of saying the same things 130 years after Ambedkar. So one of the ways, so what I'll be doing today is I'll be reading from some portions of today's talk which I've written, and then some notes that I added to it, for the simplest reason that I'm ADHD. So if I were to speak extempore, we'll all be here for longer than we intend to be. So for today's conversation, I'll be talking about primarily three things. So policy judgments and governance, which has everything to do with lawmaking and its implementation. And that's where I place my assertions, seeing that that sort of remains, in my opinion, still one of those controllable factors where direct benefits and direct justice can be ensured, right? Like there can be multiple ways of seeing it. You can assess it in terms of publics and media and so on, but everything comes down to this, and everything is sort of superseded by this. And so the yeah, okay, so this is sort of an introductory text that trans identities have been a part of Indian society forever, but like very similarly to how Dalits and trans identities have always sort of remained to the margins, and they have not been able to occupy a central space in the Indian society, very similar to how caste patriarchy actually wants it, right? So Dalits will build the center of the city, but will remain the outliers. Hijras will be allowed to come in for specific ceremonies, but will also remain the outliers. And so it's very common that you would find the Hijra Basti neighboring a Dalit Basti. And but the historical trajectories are different. So in the post-Ambedkar era, Dalit leadership has found ways to argue for itself, whereas for trans rights, the only conversations that begin and the only conversations that we know of happen due to recent judgments. So there's a difference in terms of when do these identities come into public discourse and how. Um, so in case of Dalits, just the sheer number of Dalits that exist in the subcontinent is sort of makes it not possible to not talk about them. Whereas with trans people, it's always the game of numbers that bureaucrats like to play. Um, I will not be talking about, so as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned, but I would largely say that there are two contesting perspectives. And I know that now in the woke era, it's not okay to draw binaries, but I want to draw the binary, because otherwise you will not know what the opposite of capitalism is and what the opposite of racism is. And I think there is an opposite there. And so I'll be drawing two perspectives within these contentious views within the trans communities in India, queer trans communities in India, and also to sort of look at to not look at, in fact, things which are very universal. So like left projects across the world draw from similar literature. Nationalistic projects, ethno-nationalistic projects are very, very similar across borders. Uh, and you will also see this funny thing that when ideologies are arguing for each other, even if they're right, even if they're left, there's a basic common minimum they sort of agree on, which generally tends to be the socialists. And it's so very well displayed in Indian socialists if you go into their history of who they side with in which what regime. At least on policy, they all say that socialism is our common bare minimum, because otherwise it's going to be impossible to get elected. So I'm only going to focus on the anti-caste ideology and the Hindutva ideology. Hindutva ideology because of the times we live in, and anti-caste ideology because of the times we want to live in. And so, which is why they are sort of constantly in contestation with each other. Yeah, so that's the introductory bit. And now I will just read the three parts. So one, what goes into making of policy. Second, I'll draw from judgments. And finally, to reiterate, would be how, when these policies are implemented for trans people, what actually happens there, right? Is somebody able to make some ground and something, what changes there, what shifts there? So one of the ways in which central governments in India have promised economic rights to its citizens is through the fiscal budget. But studies by organizations such as NCDHR show that not only do Dalits not get their proportional share as outlined in the direct schemes, no government since independence has actually allotted the amount to Dalits that it claimed to. Moreover, only a fraction of the fraction that is assigned is actually used on Dalits, whereas rest is used to provide for other costs that do not directly benefit Dalit populations. For example, they would bill a road expenditure which is going towards the Dalit village as an expenditure on Dalits. Whereas there is money allocated for building roads, which should which should also make roads which go to Dalit villages, right? So despite the multi-layered problems of why the resources meant for Dalits don't reach them, it is important to note that Dalit women who make roughly 50% of the Dalit population have very few schemes for themselves. While it is important to make the existing schemes more dynamic, it is also important to bite into the larger piece of the cake, that is sectional policies that do not seem casted, such as resources allotted for women, disabled, etc., which are all treated as casteless categories. Such intersectional gaps inadvertently and sometimes by design end up privileging upper caste bodies over Dalit ones. Take, for example, compensation outlined for sexual assault in different laws, such as POA or the Nirbhaya Act, right? Or this new category of economically backward classes, what it allows for a citizen to be considered economically backward in the basis of their income versus versus what is laid out for, say, OBC students, for example. So if you compare, you'll see disparities there. Yeah, within the criteria laid out for them. In case of laws dealing with trans people, this difference is the starkest in case of the Nalsa judgment, a landmark judgment that, among other things, outlined the right to self-determination for trans people and directed the government to provide affirmative action for trans communities. This is where interventions of Dalit trans activists like Grace Banu outline what were to go wrong if all trans people were clubbed under other backward classes, OBC. It would deprive SC and ST trans people of their constitutional rights and safeguards and pitch them directly with their oppressor castes. Reservations are an economic right, while activists like Grace argue for horizontal representation within the trans communities. There's a pushback from Hindutva trans groups to have one category and one policy only for trans people in India. Now, I have introduced a character, also a dear friend and guide, Grace Bano. I have to also introduce a character on the other side of the story, which is also a great activist called Lakshminarayan Tripathi, who many of you might be familiar of work with. Many of you aren't, can always look her up. And I would like to use this anecdote. Many of us who are from the communities, from the movement, know that when the trans bill agitation was going on, which I will touch upon in the judgments section, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi infamously remarked that grace is the Shabri to their Ram. And Shabri is this mythological character which is lower caste, and of course has to have the benevolence of Ram to, eat the same food as her and whatever, to be lifted to from a common person to like, somebody of some relevance and importance, that even the god is able to share, a food which would otherwise be considered polluted. Um, so this anecdote I would come back to when I end the presentation, and why this particular anecdote was so important and sharing. And of course, this is a horribly casteist thing to say to someone. And there was legit pushback about the statement that LNT made. LNT is the short for Lakshmi Tripathi. Okay, so a similar contestation and contradiction emerges when it comes to arguing for trans rights in the court. For example, the same court that reads down 377 is the one that brings a trans and anti-trafficking bill that criminalizes traditional forms of families, of traditional form of trans families and kinship and begging. Uh, to understand this more, we would have to go into what led to reading down of 377 and the subsequent introduction of the trans bill. Rights to privacy judgment was tied to Ambedkar's doctrine of fundamental rights, but in a way that would belie their spirit. Ambedkar included the right to property in the earlier drafts of fundamental rights, and later argued in parliament about what the government could do in order to make land accessible to Dalits. This right to privacy judgment primes people who are propertied or those who have access to property over those who don't. It is to be noted that much of the noise generated around 377 was about making gay marriage possible. One might wonder why the proponents of gay marriage would not borrow from work on interreligious and intercaste marriages in their arguments, or learn from the critiques of gay marriage in the West, where state doesn't provide for alternate form of kinship and citizens outside the recognized forms of monogamous marriage. But the response lies in disenfranchising trans communities further. This is all part of the larger respectability project that right-wing queer organizations push for. So it's very interesting that when they're talking about economy, there's a certain way that you can argue for economy. You could say that so many people we lose to manual scavenging. So if you were to industrialize it and you were to open it to other castes, you would have this labor force which could add substantially to the economy. You could say if you were to ensure rights of sex worker unions, they are all working. It's one of the oldest professions existing across societies. It would be good for the economy. But for some reason, the other perspective, which I'm not naming because I want people to guess, says that it's better that India goes and occupies certain territories and frees the gaze of those lands and bring economic development from those lands. They would also say that pink washing is a thing, so we must invite as many white European gays here and make it a tourism hotspot and gain money out of it. So it often toes the line of homo nationalism and pink washing, very reminiscent of things which are happening in other parts of the world. Tel Aviv being a cousin of sorts in that case to us, to Delhi. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Um, yeah, I think this argument is important, that I argue that this fundamental difference of one defining one's own self-respect to that of being treated as respectful in a society that grades respect and doesn't consider everyone respectful is driven by caste supremacy. So it's a fundamental difference. That's why self-respect is such an important discourse in Dalit literature. Like you will constantly hear conversation about dignity and self-respect. Like why are these words so important to communities which are constantly portrayed as they don't have shelter, they don't have food, education, can't speak, and so on and so forth. Like anything that makes a person human, right? So they're portrayed as inhuman and less than human, right? So why, after all these things that they could organize around, would they organize around self-respect and yeah, self-respect and dignity? The final bit of it, I'm just going to go through my notes also to see I have not forgotten something important, but we can also come back to it during the questions. Yeah, I think I've covered the most important bits and we can push back on any of these points that I've made so far. The final segment I want to talk about is how the welfare schemes are implemented. So now reservation is also a welfare scheme. And when reservation is argued, then of course, there is a film called, I think, is it called Gunda? There's a film now. There's a film out there. Vicky Kaushal's brother is in it. Please Google it. Hurdang, yes. Okay, great. Just watch that film. You'll get the perspective. I think we should watch all kinds of film. I'm one of those rare academics who says watch everything, read everything, and then make up your mind. But then there's a pushback against reservations. There's not a similar kind of pushback when economically backward is introduced, but there's a pushback when caste-based reservations are introduced. And so this pushback is very interesting to me because when it happens in corporate spaces and somebody queer, often of a certain caste, comes and says that, oh my God, diversity and inclusion. You know, we don't care that 25% of Dalits and Adivasis can't enter our spaces, but we must have the gays. Everybody claps. It's a thing. It becomes a bestseller. It becomes a policy so soon. So so that is one way that welfare is like sort of a dubious thing, that you are able to, like, only certain positions are able to ask for it while negating others' rights for it. And the other way welfare is done is through direct money being given and granted. So for the final segment, I would like to talk about welfare in the context of trans empowerment. But before that, it is important to foreground that the budget, judiciary, and history of welfare in India is deeply enmeshed in the fabric of caste. A prime example of this would be the ruling party's parent organization, which has old roots in philanthropy and undertaking welfare missions. There are trans welfare boards now cropping up in multiple states, but they are also contested on the grounds of representations and resource allocation. What this discourse smoke screens is the actual work of building cooperatives for trans people or conversations of land-based reparations that Dalit or indigenous trans people can be entitled to legally. And there are studies that demonstrate that social movements need capital to sustain themselves. But for right-wing queer organizations, it's possible to divorce welfare from the state, diversity and inclusion from affirmative action, marriage from caste, and economy from sex. While Dalit trans voices are clear about placing their demands, multiple of them have written about having casted experiences within the queer community and organize around anti-caste principles. This opens a lot of new avenues for reimagining and renegotiating the deeply unequal constructs of caste and gender. Manusmriti, a text Ambedkar burnt, outlines punishments for both homosexuals and the lower castes. It is observation that multiple Dalit trans people who contest local body elections across party lines and through disparate geographies have common agendas of sanitation and education for their communities. There are contemporary histories between Dalit and trans leadership and common futures for all of us. And just to push back on each of the things I mentioned in terms of welfare, so many a times it happens that the subjectivity of Dalit and Adivasi trans queer people is completely lost. So there is a precedent where trans people are able to file an atrocities act on their upper caste sexual harassers without having to go around 377 or anything else, because that is something which is already in the constitution. Similarly, this idea of reparations based on representation is possible because there is a precedent within the how constitution evolved and later on how land reorganization has happened. So in the states where land reorganization took place, they did it according to who holds what land, right? But if they did it in terms of which is the community which has the least amount of land, you know, which needs to be given land by the government, or how Ambedkar argued it about it in the parliament. Ambedkar also said, would the government who holds, a government of India holds a lot of land, would they make it accessible to the landless community? And it doesn't have to be Dalits actually. It has to be, there are more, you know, like Delhi is like a city of migrants who were given land by the government. So there's so much precedent around it. But these conversations will never happen and they will remain on a level of diversity and inclusion and welfare boards, which is just like, you know, 1%, 2%, which never reaches. because it's not the agenda. And I'm actually really talking common sense here at this point. But this common sense is very uncommon, which sort of also defeats all the work we do. But yeah, I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Aro, for this really wonderful and provocative talk. We'll open it up for questions, questions or comments. For the students who've joined us online, you can raise your hand and Natasha will moderate it. Yes, please go.
I can't hear you.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much and coming out about this topic. I understand that talking about lived experiences like your caste and your gender identity it can be extremely traumatic. So thank you for taking the time out to come and educate us, even though it wasn't on you. Secondly, the question that I have is as someone who while somewhat trans, but I don't know how non-binary falls into this, I'm not sure. But it's still from a upper class, how is it that we can contribute towards making the space more inclusive for and intersectional, especially in a in a college like this, which is dominated by liberal ideology, which has a very liberal approach. How do we make these spaces more inclusive and radical and less than, I don't know, just more human in general, I think?
I mean, if I came across as radical and left and so on, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I am none of that. I'm a part of the managerial class. So I am very much a part of the establishment. Um, but I would say that we should stop thinking in terms of institutions and individuals. Many of us have done that. And I always believe that campus activism should be rigorous and strong, even if liberal, even if left leaning. But political ideologies always have blind spots and are not solutions. And we all organize our lives in terms of political philosophies. Um, but to answer the first part of your question, I would definitely say, and also because as a non-binary person myself, I'm trans as well. I'm sorry, I can't say some words, but yeah, I am as trans as it gets, and the trans umbrella includes everybody, non-binary and binary trans people, and people who are not either of those also, because the idea is to do away with gender. Ambedkar asked for annihilation of caste. Ambedkar didn't say, oh my God, accommodate 1,001 castes. And that is what the idea of inclusion argues for, that as long as we can accommodate 70 identities of gender, it's going to be okay. But no, there will be a 71st identity of gender, which will not be okay with the preceding 70. The idea is to annihilate gender also. And caste is gender is caste, it's a caste patriarchy. But as upper caste people, I feel like for sure reparations, uh, all of those who are on a professional track, making your time and your resources accessible to the communities, having pro bono slots. I don't know, it works very differently in different occupations, but I can assure you, because I come from a family which was involved in left activism, uh, they did have work for literally everybody, from contractors to website designers to lawyers to teachers. So social movements do need everyone. So as long as I think you're concentrating on those two things, I think your heart is in the right place. Yeah.
Thank you. You had a question? Yes.
So my question is, how do we break the cycle of co-education? And if the top-down approach is so far enough in solving that issue, because when we're talking about politics and when we're talking about coming from a position of hierarchy, like it's still hierarchical model. And I'm interested in knowing how this top will just decide, okay, then okay, let's make the space more inclusive, and whether it will ever go far enough in making it inclusive in music.
Wow, we have a very philosophical bunch. I'm also thinking as you guys are thinking. I have never been in a place which didn't have hierarchies, to be fair. Like, I have to be honest. And so I don't know if hierarchies are going to go, or if hierarchies is the only way that humans know how to organize. No matter how much you say, oh my God, we are all conveners, we're all facilitators, we're all a collective. Some people do get more exposure than others. And in some places, I'm the person who does not get it. In some places, I am that person who gets it also. But yeah, can you repeat the other bit of your question?
So,
The representation question, right?
so what do you think will break the cycle of representation?
Yeah, the tokenism. As I said, this is why the scholarship, it might seem like, oh my God, we're talking at the level of politicians and governance and law. But really, like, what is more representative than the fact that if you have a media of 100 people and 25 people are Dalit and Adivasi in this country, you have them ensured that they have their jobs, right? Because most of the media, so if you look at the Oxfam report, hardly any Dalits and Adivasis make into English newsrooms. They have done it on major journalistic organizations in India. And so the representational bit, if it's only left to those of us who are visible and those of us who are a voice, it's a structural problem. Same on the level of politics, right? So wo jo starting mein de diya constituent assembly ko, what they gave in the beginning to constituent assembly for Dalits, that's what it has remained. But if you say, okay, let's do a caste census now, let's readjust in terms of how many Dalits are there. Let's even see them in the parliament. These are actually not demands which are original in any way. They have been made. They have been made multiple times by many anti-caste thinkers. It's just that anti-caste. It's a fact that anti-caste histories have always relied on solidarity with other castes to be able to make it in these spaces. It cannot happen if only one section feels that this is our right and this is what we need to get. And for that reason, I ended my conversation by saying it's our future, because I don't believe that it's only, and sometimes when I say these things, many people get agitated, some for the right reasons, some for horribly wrong reasons. But I do not believe that upper caste people want a casteist future, you know, as, and I don't think Dalits ever wanted it, like it's the same thing. I don't think anybody wants a casteist future. I think all of us want a casteist future. It's my hope. Like I'm not, it's, like it's irrational hope. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, three.
Also, when we have discussions about sexual politics, etc., so usually we tend to use the hierarchy even when it comes to fights with different groups. I remember us having this conversation with class as well. So when we basically talk about, for example, when we talk about anti-caste politics, it usually just mostly tends to focus on caste, whereas the other groups like queer community sort of their voices aren't as visible or heard. So we tend to move into these groups to homogenize them so that it's easier for us to work along those lines. So I kind of wanted to understand when we talk about, especially considering it's about casting queer aspirations, how can you make sure that this intersectional politics are enough maybe homogenizing the same groups and then we tend to follow the same cycle of problems. Like first we deal with this, then move with it.
I would not know how to end cyclic violence. That's for one. But then when we're talking about this intersectional bit, I would want you to repeat your question. Sorry.
It's not so clear in my head either, but
No, your question was very clear, but then I was running my mind with it, so I lost it. So
So when basically government intersection politics, what tends to happen is
Sorry, I remember your question. Okay, great. Your question was about visibility, right? So basically, we'll say Dalit is this box, and then now queer is gone, disabled is gone, etc. Blah. Yeah. The question I would ask would be a different one. Would be that does Dalit queer people being visible, and there's like at least like a dozen, and like if you go to the Dalit queer project, there's 50 faces there and so on, and then we work with hundreds and so on and so forth. Uh, does visibility translate to policy change? Does visibility translate to material benefits? Does visibility translate to authenticity? You know, like authentic, honest politics, authentic, honest, collective politics that goes beyond community, that transcends our community. It, in most of our cases, it doesn't. It leads to violence, which is why something like a Dalit Queer project exists, where we don't even put the faces, you know, like the faces like a photograph of us. We sit, an artist from the community sits, the another person comes in, tells a story or gives a poem or whatever they want to say really to the community. It's a dialogue within the community. So those 50 people are talking within each other. And people think that, okay, we are only an Instagram page. That's not true. We generate books, we generate works, but we keep it for ourselves. We generate research, we keep it for ourselves because we understand that we anyway get calls from people from the community all across, right? So we do have community networks, but we particularly do not find visibility useful. We feel visibility doesn't translate for us the same way. So it's still gonna happen that you're gonna have 10 trans activists, which are whatever trailblazers, and then 9 of them are Brahmins, and then there's one Dalit one, and that the one Dalit one would change every year because you know you can't have the same person every time. Uh, that's what it is. So I would place my weight on material instead of visibility. I hope that answers your question.
Bishop, please.
Bonus from what you answered earlier. So when you talk of things like redistributive justice and giving back and material benefits, how do you then also counter the fissures within communities where there are opposing demands from both sides? So there is no solidarity even within the small communities, right? And I feel like often the burden is placed on the community itself to keep advocating for these things instead of people coming to them and saying that these societies should happen in a certain manner, etc. So how do you see people who are looking to get into these spaces that work with people to advance different approaches to justice, working through these fissures within communities and getting different groups together, be it like political ideology differences or others?
What are these communities that you refer to? Small communities?
No, I mean like even within, say, when you look at the transgender umbrella terms, there are smaller groups that are very, very radically opposite in terms of like we were mentioning, there's the race convent, there's the African party, right? So when you talk of material benefits and welfare benefits reaching them directly, how does one counter the fissures within the movement without falling into that whole
right as an outsider? Yeah, right. I get your question. The only thing I would push back against is that by no means are these communities small or together, because
it's not one large community agreeing on everything. There are differences in within that.
I mean, like any other community, right? And like any other community, we have differences. But just for also like for students to know that the trans community in India is like one of the biggest trans populations in the world. And I only introduced the characters of LNG and Grace, but they both of them as community leaders have like hundreds of people around them, you know. Yeah. So in any sense of community, they would even transcend, I think, the word community. They would become communities if one were to do justice to them sociologically. And but I see your question in terms of like how does it as an outsider do this. I think there's just no way to do it right. You just spend your time with the community. Like I don't know the right way to do it, and anybody who says that they know the right way to do it, I'm gonna be very critical and doubtful of, because if everybody is doing the right thing, where is the reality, right? So for me, that's something which is very important, and that's the only way to stay and figure out like what is working, what is not working. Unfortunately, politics remains that terrain which is so experimental. But I think at the same time, when one is experimenting, one also should be careful of the costs, like the costs people are paying in terms of, for example, this whole language of justice, redistributive justice, is so limited and is so such a minority strain even within universities, even within law schools. Forget it being mainstreamed in law school and then possibly being mainstreamed in other social science branches, because procedural justice or redistributive justice is so important in all aspects. It has to be done historically, it has to be done spatially, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
I had a question. Please go.
So could you equate being against reservation as being casteist?
Yes. I mean, one could give me a position which is against reservation, which is not casteist, and I would also accept that. But yes, it's a very thin line. Yeah.
Yes, Marie.
You mentioned about Hinduism ideology. My question is very simple. Like, how do you think in the last decade has the Hinduism ideology and the rise in the current politics changed what are so activists from trans Dalit communities? Like, what are there new problems or new issues which have emerged, or like issues which were there a couple of decades ago which have come up again in a much more stronger force? Like, so how exactly is the path and dynamics changed for them like moving forward?
Right. I heard your question and then I realized that there was one part of your question that I did not answer. So I'm going to do that and then I want to do this. This is ADHD in action, you guys. um, the thing about communities talking about themselves, right? Like the burden of it lying on themselves. It's a casted history unto itself. It's historically been that. Ki Dalits ko burn, like they've been burned, sexual assault has happened, systematically has happened, land has been grabbed and so on. But that's why that is why I remain so optimistic, because we have to cultivate hope. We have to cultivate radical, foolish hope to heal from caste. Otherwise, it can't happen, because it's a casted history that we are born in. It's such a violent history. In any society, in any civilized society, in any developed, whatever country, I don't care about those classifications. A human is supposed to feel bad about another human experiencing this kind of visceral loss, and upper caste people are robbed of that humanity from their childhood and generations on. So that is also violence, and that has to be understood by them within their communities as a conversation. But just to come to your end, I would say that of course, like, things are bad as they are for everyone else, but the great thing about being Dalit and trans is that no ruling establishment gives a hoot about us. Nobody has ever reached us. Nobody's ever till now, like, because, so as I said, like, imagine they're not reaching Dalit women, 50% Dalit women. Like, Dalit women are 8% of this country uh, population, and that does not include the Muslim Dalit women and the Christian Dalit women. So could be 10%. So every 10th person in this country is a Dalit woman. They are not reaching them only. By the time they reach Dalit trans, it will be some other kind of bureaucracy which would be in place.
So I meant more in terms of violence and more in terms of problems created, like
Yeah.
which could not be as institutional, but in just terms of ground reality. So, for example, at least in what I personally see is that there's been a rise in violence towards Dalit women, particularly like especially young kids in around Delhi and a lot of places, especially which have made it the news as well, and which has also been very normalized in the last decade, which has also been happening, which I'm not saying it's not,
Yeah.
but particularly I feel like there's a rise in it. So I was focusing, is there any particular issues or any particular violence which has been on the increase towards Dalit trans people?
What do you attribute this rise to? Like, do you?
So Hindu ideology.
No, no,
The
no.
rise in, okay.
Like, factually, yes. Conceptually, we are there. But factually, has there been a report which they compare, say, 2015 onwards and like from 2000 to 2005? I mean, there should be for sure. But it might just be that typical case of co-effect and causality, right? Like correlation and causality, like one never knows. It's a good question to think around. But I would say that this is for the first time in the past 10 years that now there's a systematic literature and media which responds to all the anti-caste literature that came up in the recent years, which created some sort of a sensitive mass because for the first time ever you had so many university graduates who were Dalits and Adivasis who were able to create noise from these sort of central education spaces, which we all know the names of. Yeah. So there is that media response to it for sure, which wasn't existing. You know, it's possible today for somebody to say, "Ki, this is not so bad. This we didn't have. We don't have precedence of it." Of course, at some level, some judge, some small politician will say it, but having a whole media machinery to support that point of view sort of is a more magnified thing for sure. Yeah.
Are there other questions or comments? Yes, please go ahead.
I have another question, which is pointing about and how there needs to be material change in order to bring real change. Because if everyone is doing something, where is the change? Do you think that if like the lower caste people have to work in solidarity with the upper caste people, as long as the work of the upper caste people go, it will never really bring the material change. It will always be limited to physical change. And the reason I'm asking this is because based on experiences here, because there are multiple centers that are doing work, but it isn't bringing any material change because even the policy in the academic area is inaccessible to the people we are talking about, which is the people who are working in
There's so many layers to what you said, but let me begin with the first one. The first one is to say that it would be misquoting me to think that I said, oh my God, upper caste people need to give solidarity with Dalit people to like work. That's not what I said. What I said was every time Dalit people have succeeded, so it's a very similar way to how like whenever American blacks organized around rights or civil rights, there were some white people who lent them solidarity and who were part of social movements. So to not limit social movements to particular identities, because that defeats the purpose. As I said, the goal of the anti-caste movement, which is that of a casteless future, benefits everyone, including upper caste people, which is what I went into later, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing I quite agree that the academia in general, Indian academia, how it should be, how it can be, we have never thought. Till now, all our curriculums have white European men who did not step out of their country or, or stepped out and did things we don't talk about. And so we have not thought about it. And academic violence does happen. I guess as students and in academia, we're all a part of it, but we all figure out ways of how to navigate that violence and figure out whether there's some tangible benefit to that violence and what we are doing in academia or not. Yeah, and I always tell young people that there's a big world out there outside academia. Yeah, but once we go on that route, it should not be from a place of righteousness because anti-caste scholarship harshly advocates against any kind of political pure sort of righteousness because we are just born by accident in a very unjust society, you know.
Sorry, there are a couple of hands up. So let me, Sriram, and then Gayatri, and I didn't get your name, Palika, and then Maria. Yeah,
So
we can take these questions together.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, so I want to ask about queer spaces in general, and you mentioned hierarchy in queer spaces, which I'm sure most queer people would agree as well. There's already a hierarchy between cisgendered people who are sexually queer versus the trans community, non-gender queer persons in a queer space as well. Then caste is added to that dynamic, and I added in a very crude way. The experience itself becomes very different. So I wanted to ask, how does is there a space for, I think when you're talking about solidarity and when you're talking about working together on a caste front, is there space for a sort of rainbow coalition in terms of how queer spaces can work? Is there a space for trans voices and trans Dalit voices in those larger spaces to navigate themselves as a separate group? Or is there an opportunity for these groups to come together on certain common oppressions and work on those set of oppressions together while working on the aspect of caste and queerness as a separate intersectionality in a separate manner among themselves as separate groups?
This word intersectionality, I think, is often overused and also abused in academia because it doesn't stick to what Crenshaw did with it. It's actually a legal analysis tool which allows you to put two policies in comparative and see what the gaps that emerge. I don't think it's so much more than useful than to understanding contexts within societies necessarily, because it's also a tool originally made by a Black woman to understand their oppression. And the way that the oppression of race works is fundamentally different than that of how caste operates. That is one very important sort of thing, I would say, because there was many mentions of intersectionality across. The other thing you talk about is how just social movements are arranged. What you said is actually how they're arranged right now. There are Dalit queer people working among the community, and then there are Dalit queer people, like same Dalit queer people, who are also working with larger coalitions, because you do what is with hope, right? Like, do we want gays to be able to marry? Sure. But what we also want is that those of us who will not end up marrying anybody are just going to be like old trannies, like doing kitty parties. We also want to be taken care of by the government. We also want health benefits and pension and so on. And if I just want to live with my two sisters, then let me be two trans sisters, like just give me the same benefits. So it's on that level that one is arguing for. But I do feel that caste and queerness should be everybody's agenda and it should be throughout. You mentioned it as if it's like sexuality and then the gender thing and then the caste. I don't think it's that. I think it's a caste patriarchy. And the caste patriarchy in itself outlines, your position. So it's always that. So there's nobody who's gay. It's an upper caste gay person. It's an Adivasi gay person. So it's about also marking the upward mobile identities, right? Another very important thing, which was, I think, somewhere around the non-binary question and identities, was also that we have not ever read transness before transness came to us via the academic route. Growing up, I was of that generation. I don't know, it makes me seem old. I'm only 24, but we didn't know Karan Johar was gay, guys, like till the time I was later in my school. And I was always called Bobby Darling, or I was always called like Chucky or Hijra or so on and so forth. So we have these local trans ethnic minorities which have very specific cultural, socio-religious contexts. And irrespective of whether we identify as that or not, or whether we are part of the Gharana system or not, we are read as that. Like, Kanmani is here, I'm here. We're just like, I'm read as feminine. It doesn't matter what I'm wearing and what I identify as and what body I'm given. So I think people who are engaging with gender and sexuality in terms of scholarship really need to figure out their own language rather than just taking this, and I think it responds to your question also of how universities arrange and so on. I think this is one of those little ways in which we kink and queer the university.
Yes.
I'm sorry, but I'm still trying to understand how an anti-caste teacher is sort of beneficial to all, especially if it means that upper caste will have to basically won't have the kind of privileges they would have in a caste patriarchy. So why would they essentially be motivated to mobilize against one-on-one?
Could you define privilege for me?
Sorry?
Could you define privilege for me?
in the invisible ways it occurs in society, it is like how basically caste is sort of a religion itself, because only upper caste will get to be caste.
Right. So some kind of special treatment.
It's something that operates invisibly as it is, and it's
Right.
part of society, but we don't get to.
Right.
Yeah.
And why would privilege not be thought in terms of being loved by everyone, being more human, feeling the pain of others, uh, having a society where everybody can have access to land and water and education? Why is that not a privileged view of the society? Why is that not what upper castes would want to invest in rather than what they have right now?
In a way, they have most of the things you just mentioned. It's just that why would they want to kind of like work for the other people?
I don't think they do. I don't think that they have all this. I think the construct of upper caste is a deeply violent one. I mean, if upper castes have all this, how do you define all the feminist movements in India? What are they asking for? 50% of upper castes are women only. So what are they asking for? Why are they saying let us out in the night? We want to be free. Give us equal hostel times. Take away marital rape. Like you will not be able to understand the Indian society without the injustices upper caste people have perpetuated on themselves.
Next. Sorry. Okay, let me.
No, that's fine.
So two students, can you wait? Because we got an opportunity to ask questions. We just want to also focus on our students online.
Sure. So we have a question from Rashi.
Yeah.
What are some examples of violence within academia? How do we ensure that we don't perpetuate such violence?
It's very difficult to not perpetuate violence when you're in academia. I don't know what people are sitting here, if it's like PhD, MA, BA mix, but if it's BA people, then I don't want to scare you away. by the time you arrive as a part of this professional managerial class and you start applying grants, these are all places, like either they're horrible families with past of slave owners or bonded laborers, or they are organizations which are meddling with democracy, are funding terrorist organizations. There's no way out, you guys. Like, I'm sorry, like if you're a part of it, then you're a part of it. That's the one, to put it bluntly. Oh my God, I hope I don't lose jobs because I have some grants going on right now. But I think on an ethical level, in terms of what one can control, and I'm quite actually against it. This idea that, oh my God, I'm going to become this hotshot Zizekishes and Noam Chomsky academic. Like, sorry, you have to be extremely privileged to be that, and you're gonna affect so few people because your books are gonna cost 10,000 on Amazon. And so what is important is to think of your scholarship as collaborative and as building towards something, and to make it accessible to people who don't have access to it, to build scholarship, to not build scholarship on communities and experiences you don't have yourself, and to just like make it a collaborative thing, and figure out as one goes. I think for me, what has been important, I've not so far worked outside my community, but I have worked with people from differing experiences than me. And yeah, just being able to listen. I think we don't do anything in academia actually to make people listen, and to be able to really listen and not just hear someone is so important, because then that's when you really grasp what's going on. And again, this is all bullshit qualitative research nonsense, because if half of you are going to do data and stats, then this is not going to be useful to you. But this is the basic of social research, I think.
Pinky.
Yeah, so my question is more related to teaching and ensuring a certain level of sensitivity among students. So I teach gender and society. One does struggle when we do modules on gender. I mean, we begin the course by kind of breaking the normative binary illusion and moving from there. So I have always wondered. So one is that students from all kinds of backgrounds and different levels of sensitivity, different levels of transphobia, homophobia, etc. You need to address all of them, right? And you're never sure how much you're going to achieve at the end of the semester. But there's something that I tried, and this is really not a question, and I want to know, I would like to hear from you what you think about this, and please feel free to tell me if I'm absolutely wrong in the way I kind of went about this. So it's just an example I'll give you. So I kept feeling that, we teach the law, we teach the policy, we tell them what's wrong with the law, etc., and, give false perspectives. When you're really talking about lived experiences, especially when you talk about Dalit trans persons or Dalit non-binary persons. For instance, we teach them Dhruva Jyoti's love letters. So while I was doing the love letters, of course, we did speak about the gender identity and the caste identity and the concept of purity and pollution and the transition from youth to the acceptance and all of that. But while I was doing that, at the end of we read the letter, when we had students discuss it, etc. This is just an instinctive thing that I did, and I'm really scared that I've done the right thing. So I just want to share that. I'm really risking sounding amazingly foolish here, but I want to get your opinion on this. So at the end of it, I told them, I said, we've discussed the differences, right? Let's try and focus on similarities in terms of emotions, in terms of insecurities. We are constantly saying, how everybody's experience is different, and that everybody should include everybody irrespective of their gender identity. That's what we're trying to achieve here. So think about how you are able to relate to Dhruva Jyoti's love letter. Where do you see yourself, irrespective of your own gender identity? We all have insecurities in different ways, and they play out differently, more or less, etc. So look at the similarities as well. Just try to kind of see. My intent was to bring a little bit of that humanity. Eventually you need humanity to be able to relate to each other's experience. So, and can we? And this is my question. Can we achieve that sense of that sensitivity towards being human before being, before putting any other sort of differences over that? Unless we try to see that we are all essentially the same. And the differences are what we are defining for ourselves, which is, what we are moving towards, right? Is it right for me to kind of think through this the way I thought through this? You understand what I'm saying? Because, everybody's at a different level. How do you kind of get them on that same page to think? Because some people will immediately clamp because they don't want to look at an experience of a young person who is experiencing love, passion, insecurities differently from what they've experienced. Because we've been taught to not think beyond our own experience. So it's just a little experiment I did, and I felt really insecure after doing it because I thought I could be doing it all wrong, but instinctively I felt it's not a bad idea to ask people to look at similarities as well, because there is a similarity of emotions. We all feel fear, we all feel insecurities. And then, see how there might be differences there and try and relate to each other.
I have a lot of interest in pedagogy. I find it very interesting. For the simplest reason that I have only fought my teachers since school onwards. And I was very surprised that a professor of mine literally from Ambedkar dropped in and recognized me and was very happy to see me. So I was like, why are they happy? I made their life hell when I was there. So I am very interested in pedagogy also, because when I would see departments, I would be like, why is there a Dalit studies department and not a upper caste studies department and so on? And but what you're doing is basically an exercise in empathy, right? And I think exercise in empathy work great on an introductory level, but not what you were aiming for, which was to aim a level of sensitization, right? Mm-hmm. But that's my limitation also. I don't know what leads to it. Because the thing with exercises of empathy is that empathy is not a good enough container to stay with. You can reach there in a place where you are not feeling anything and you are yourself in a stable place and so on. That's when you can go into those emotions. But to stay there and constantly stay there it's not possible until you fall in love with a person who faces that. And I mean love as a broad category of friendship, and not only of courtship, but also of friendship and of family and kinship and with your co-workers, right? Because that's the only relationships I have seen sustained. That's also relationships Ambedkar entered into and benefited from, right? So I do find empathy as a container which is limiting, and also to look at it the other way. It is the fact that like my parents were intercaste marriage, and I can tell for a fact that we expect this kind of humility to expand and this empathy to expand. It just doesn't. Like I always tell my upper caste female colleagues who are feminists, just look at your brothers and fathers. Do you think their empathy and humility is expanding? So if it's not expanding on that end, then here it's like a world of difference. It's not gonna happen. I think what is going to happen is like as long as what I mentioned, like long-term engagements, and they can be engagements with community, and they can be engagements in interpersonal, and it is constant work. There's no easy solutions. Yeah. Thank you.
So there are three more questions. Should we take them? We're running out of time, but I just wanted to see if it's
Yeah.
okay. Okay, I know Mamika, you've been waiting, so you please go ahead. Then
Talking about is this huge conflict between just wanting to be human first and wanting to like have an identity, because to ask for suppose say like as king, you have to define who you're giving it to, and that means limiting yourself to a certain identity, whether it be trans, queer, whatever, Dalit, it's a certain identity. But at the same time, it just feels sometimes personally it just feels very reductive, because when you do that, it just feels like, oh, they are just the non-binary queer person. So how do you navigate this space of conflict between being more than your identity, being passionate enough to advocate for that identity? I mean, I'm not sure if
No, I get what you're saying. And I think this is exactly where identity politics in universities goes wrong, which is that you're not supposed to feel anything about policy change. A policy exists. Many times trans people didn't even exist in policies until Britishers came around, said, can't put all of them in jail. So it's not like trans people weren't around and they weren't happy and they weren't going about their life. They were. But it's just that when they brought in the law, they became really sad. So I feel policies we should not be emotional about, and we shouldn't feel that, oh my God, we are being reduced in the policy, because policy is a place where everybody is reduced, even our country is reduced in policy, right? So that's the nature of policy. Uh, Other than that, I guess one is free to explore their humanity in other ways, right? But I would also say that for some communities, it is important. Like, for example, when the Dalit community says and puts their name in policy, it's so important because they are arguing for a humanity that they were denied. Similar with trans communities. So it's not that just them asking for that right in itself becomes reductive. It does not, in my opinion. Sorry, before we take the next question, I wanted to also respond to the teaching thing. One thing I did discover and I found very useful was we generally do this curriculums on othering and abnormality and so on. A very interesting way to do it is also to do exercises about, okay, like, how is it that your kitchen is arranged? Like very open questions. And that's where caste lies. It lies in different tumblers for different people. So like asking open questions. So like there is no abnormal and there is no other. There just is in the classroom. There are people. And you would get very interesting reflections from people when you ask those open-ended questions. Yeah.
So we've been working on an approach scenario which festivals are a part of. So I particularly wanted to ask you about barriers towards access to specific reproductive healthcare by trans Dalit individuals, even like particularly like even like trans Dalit adolescents. Any like insights or issues which we face to like look into. It would be great if you could throw light into those aspects.
Maybe you could redirect those questions to the project because I'm not the best person to answer it. I have remained away from this sexual health industry for the simple reasons of my own dysphoria. And I think that people would benefit from it. The another category I've stayed away from is teenagers. They horrify me. So, so all the Dalit queer teenagers I knew, I was like, please just become adults and then we'll talk. Because, yeah. So I think on both those ends, I'm not a helpful person, but I'm sure the project can help you out.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I want to reflect us back to the idea of construct of upper caste as a very violent space, and how I would imagine that the national family planning development, all of those propaganda that we've fed about this particular heterosexual family arrangement being that of the golden family or being the space of nurture and care. And how do we this? And I think that's the narrative that all of us are being fed with constantly. So how do we like break that illusion of that particular myth of it being that safe space? But clearly it's not, but it's something that we've been fed with all the time. And there was the second question that I wanted to bring up was about how a lot of times during the whenever there was conversations about redistribution and reallocation of resources. You mentioned how a lot of those are there's a lot of precedential support for these redistributions to be encouraged and to be undertaken for, but which also centers our advocacy back to the court system, right? And how this court system in itself is a very deeply casteist institution. So how do you build? How do you navigate your friction with this institution?
Wow. Okay. The first bit I got, second bit I would have to think about and maybe come back to you to repeat it. But the first bit definitely was this, that, this whole idea that emerges of family being like this, blah, 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 etc. It's not entirely free of influence. This comes around because the British state comes in, then missionaries come in. So it's actually there. If you go into the history of it, there were multiple people pulling at it and figuring out, okay, what is this good family? Because for the Indians who were broken into so many principalities and presidencies and so on and so forth, the idea of state being so intrusive was very difficult. It was an experiment, really, right? So how do you then convince them to send their daughters to school and so on and so forth? So you say, okay, we'll do this thing. I don't know if they're still around. Whatever, these schools where they would teach you knitting and how to make tea and whatever. What were they called?
Finishing school.
Finishing schools. There were these finishing schools. They were all the vogue. Like even when I was growing up, and then they somehow vanished, or maybe I vanished from those places where they were a thing. Either of those things could have happened. But this is a very new idea, so it has not existed. But now it is existing because people have over generations gotten some benefits of it. There's a mass of people which has emerged. 75 years of a republic. So there is a mass of people which has emerged. But I don't think that mass is anywhere a critical mass or mass which has thought about, oh my God, why do I take a polio drop? Why does my daughter go to school? Why is she being fed vegetarian food in midday meals? That unfortunately is the limitation of Indian academia, that it only exists in certain addresses and networks and so on. Yeah. And the second question about the friction, I wouldn't know. I haven't done any litigation so far. We assist people on cases. We provide legal aid to the people who come to us with different cases of say violence, or if they're not getting their constitutional right and so on. But I myself have never stepped foot in the court, and I don't want to.
Okay, we have last question from Avantik, and then we have to wind up.
Okay, so the thing about human rights is that it's often abused and overused to a point where we have people like Sandra Nguyen saying that since human rights means everything to everyone, it sort of means nothing to no one. And at that point in time, when we are introduced to so many different definitions of human rights, I found one particular which strikes and which somewhat I can relate to. Is Susan Ware. She mentions that human rights is sort of within a triangle of liberty, equality, and dignity. So she mentions that human rights is nothing but the freedom to choose a substantively equal way of life in order to adopt a dignified way of living. And dignity is sort of superimposed within the idea of fraternity. So coming back to what Pinky mentioned, that the empathy leads to an equal position in life, and the love and affection which you just spoke of. So when we adopt that frame, and law, if you look at law as a policy, as a change, as an instrument of change, it is sort of forcing society to provide that fraternal way of life without providing adequate sensitization for that requirement. Does it not, sort of escalate the prejudice and, rather than doing good?
Why would you say that law is providing the space but not the
No,
infrastructure?
so how I mentioned is like we have a Prevention of Atrocities Act.
Yeah.
So there is the idea of providing, like, providing some sort of relief from the idea of atrocity. But there is no training given that, this sort of atrocity should never exist in the first place. So that sort of a sensitization, which is a precursor to the idea of the law, that is missing.
I don't agree that that's what the Atrocities Act is meant for on the prima facie. I feel the Atrocities Act is Indian state's way of acknowledging that, of course, we kill Dalits in 1,000 ways, but out of them, these 30 are the ones we acknowledge because there's so many we have to make a law about it. And that is where it's so limited. And about the sensitization, it is like this word only, like sensitization, like the history of it, like, for example, I was in a notorious sexual harassment body of Ambedkar University, CPSH. Originally, and I was also the first Dalit member on it, also the first trans member on it. But it was so notorious that originally the sensitizations would be only considered for certain jobs, and there would be the jobs which are nameless, who opens your door, who cleans your classroom, and so on and so forth, within a small microcosm of a university, which is almost representative of India, because like it's a Delhi State University, so they give percentages according to the population. Similarly, central universities give percentages according to the population of the country, and so people come in from all over. So in that sense, central universities and state universities are really like microcosms of that state and India, as close as we get to representation. And they are doing this in the name of sensitization. And it would be also different, like the people who would facilitate the sensitization would be very different. For students, they would want cool people like us. For guards, they would want whatever is the opposite of cool. Yeah, so I think that's where the issue of sensitization sort of stays. What is important for caste is to break the segregation. Without breaking caste apartheid, sensitization will not work. Because historically, caste as opposed to race, we did not have a Rosa Parks moment for the reason that like upper castes have always taken buses with Dalits, So caste always, in a different way to the racial apartheid, exists with the Dalits. It's just that Dalits are needed for particular purposes, sometimes for sexual gratification, sometimes for labor, sometimes for venting out. And then once their purpose is served, they can be done away with. So which is why, and also it's such a older, like blacks arrive on the American continent only when transatlantic slave trade sort of begins. It passed us 1,000 years. It's not changed. It's much more resilient a system and has much more of a history. So yeah.
We're going to conclude now. So everyone, please join me in thanking Aro for joining us today and giving us the space to ask so many questions and really leaving everybody with so much to think about. I'm sure the questions that I we'll have to cut it short. This has been a great start to the lecture series, and we're very, very privileged to have had the opportunity to host you in person and interact with you in such an intimate setting. So thank you so much for coming today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us in person and online for attending the lecture. We'll be holding the second lecture of the series on Thursday in this room, which will be a film screening followed by a discussion of the film. So please do come back and join us for that. That's a group of 3 activists traveling from Bengal who are coming to talk to us about a film that they have produced on the rights of transfer prior to the judgment. Thank you everyone, and thank you to everyone who is in the team, including the teacher on the team and the IT team as well for making this event possible. We'll see you next Thursday, hopefully. And again, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Amazing. Oh no, it was amazing and you were perfect. You were perfect. It was such a great provocation. Very nice.
Kishoji, please end live.